Hello, namaste. I'm very sorry I cannot be with all of you live today presenting because the time difference between where I live on the east coast of the US and India. But I'm very happy that I've had the opportunity to record my presentation so that you can hear it. And I welcome any questions or comments anyone might want to share with me afterward. I'm happy to share my contact information. I believe the organizers of the conference have that. But I will go ahead and proceed with my talk. So I'm going to share my screen. And my presentation is called Practical Anekantavada. That is applying the Jain philosophy of infinite diversity. So I want to say a bit about what I mean here by practical Anekantavada. This will become more evident as we get through the presentation. But Anekantavada is a Jain doctrine, a Jain teaching about the nature of existence. Connected closely with it are teachings about the nature of knowledge and teachings about how we ought to best express our knowledge and how we ought to best express our understanding of reality, particularly when we're engaged with conversations with people of differing worldviews and differing backgrounds. So I'm going to say quite a lot about this particular doctrine, how it emerged, its history in the context of Jain thought and Jain intellectual history. But then I want to talk about its applications in our contemporary world as well. And I've really sort of paraphrased or borrowed from Swami Vivekananda, his term practical Vedanta. His aim also was to make the ancient teaching of Vedanta relevant for his time, for our time, for the modern world, and to show how this was a very practical philosophy and not only something abstract, not only a set of abstract ideas. And so in the same way, I want to argue that Anekantavada is also a very practical philosophy that has a lot of relevance to our contemporary situation. And so I want to unpack for you what Anekantavada is and then discuss its application. So Anekantavada is one of three doctrines, three teachings, which I refer to as the Jain doctrines of relativity. I want to quickly explain what I mean by relativity. I'm borrowing here, of course, from Einstein and from physics, and not in a very detailed technical sense, but in a very broad sense, that we know that there are certain aspects of the universe and certain claims that we can make whose truth is relative, that is, whose truth is dependent upon context, upon a host of factors. And of course, when Einstein talks about relativity, one of the things that he talks about, for example, is the relationship between time and velocity, and the fact that time is measured differently. It seems to slow down the closer you get to the speed of light. So someone might go on a journey to another star system and come back, and for them, only maybe 1 month has passed. They return to Earth and find 100 years have passed on Earth. And who is right? The person for whom it was 1 month or the person for whom it was 100 years? Well, they're both correct because that time dilation is an effect of the speed at which one is traveling. And if you're traveling that speed, that is time for you. And so in the same way, if we look at philosophy, we can also see that many of the truths that we cling to, many of the ideas that are foundational to our worldviews, whatever they may be, are also relative. They also are dependent upon context and upon a whole host of factors. And the Jain tradition has understood this from a very early period. The three doctrines that really capture this idea, first is Anekantavada. This is a metaphysical or ontological claim, a view about the nature of reality itself. The claim at its most basic is that reality is anekanta, that is, it is non-one-sided, or you could say it is multiplex or multifaceted or complex. Reality is complex. There are a variety of types of being that we encounter in the universe, and there are a variety of modes of knowing those entities, which just gets us into the second doctrine, Nyayavada. This is the doctrine of Nyas, that is, perspectives. This is an epistemological claim, a claim about the nature of knowledge, and it is the claim that each aspect of reality that is affirmed in Anekantavada corresponds to a perspective from which it can be viewed. In other words, Anekantavada claims reality is complex. So imagine, let's say, a multifaceted diamond. And if you're looking at that diamond, you can see one facet that's facing you. Maybe you can see some of the other facets along the side. You can't see the facet on the other side, right? You can only see the side of the diamond that you're facing. So your ability to know and comprehend that diamond is conditioned by what you're able to access, what you're able to perceive. So each aspect of reality, each facet of the diamond corresponds to a perspective from which it can be viewed. One person is going to see this facet, someone sitting on the other side of the diamond will see another facet, and so on. Then we come to Syadvada. This is a doctrine about how to speak on the basis of Anekantavada and Nayavada. Claims are true in some sense, or in a certain respect, or from a certain perspective. In other words, you can't just say the diamond is blue, for example. Maybe the facet that's facing you is blue. Maybe someone who's viewing it from the other side sees red, and they say, no, it looks red to me. And you're both perceiving, you're both in relation to the same reality. So rather than say that one of you is right and one of you is wrong, according to Syadvada, if we conditionalize our statements, if we say, well, from my perspective, as I see it, looking at this facet, the diamond is blue. The diamond is blue in this sense and in this respect. Then that's a true statement. And it does not interfere with the opposite claim, where the diamond is red, or the diamond is green, or whatever it might be. These don't have to interfere with one another because they're relating to different aspects of a complex reality. So the idea is just about any philosophical topic we want to look at can be seen from many perspectives. Each topic has many facets, and whatever we say about that topic, the truth of our statements will be conditioned by the perspective from which we are operating. A wonderful parable that's frequently used in the Jain tradition, and in fact, there are Buddhist and Hindu variations of this parable as well, is the parable of the blind men and the elephant. You see a group of blind men, and they're all feeling a different part of the elephant. They've come upon this creature, and they've been asked to describe it. And so you see on the left, there's a man feeling the trunk. And near him, there's another man feeling the tusks. Someone else is feeling the ear. Another one's feeling a leg. Another feeling the side. Another feeling the tail. And so when each man is asked, describe the elephant, they say different things. The person handling the trunk says, this feels kind of like a large snake. Someone feeling the side of the elephant might say, doesn't feel like a snake. It really feels more like a wall. Someone else grasping the leg might say it's like a pillar or a column. And they'll hear each other's descriptions, and they'll find those descriptions don't match with their experience. So they'll start to argue. And this is what happens in the story. The blind men start to argue and fight about the nature of the elephant. Finally, someone who can see the whole elephant has mercy on them and explains an elephant is actually all of these things. You're all partially correct. Each of you is accurately describing the part of the elephant that you've experienced, that you've felt, but you're also incorrect if you deny the validity of the other claims being made, because those are all based on the experiences of those people. And in fact, an elephant has a part that is like a snake, and a part that is like a column, and a part that is like a wall, etc. And so harmony can exist, even though the substantive claims being made differ, but they're being made about different facets of reality. So they can coexist without anyone having to be completely wrong or anyone really being completely right, because no one has experienced the whole elephant. And if you think about it, even the person who can see is only seeing one side of the elephant. What's on the other side of this picture, right? Maybe we can say only the elephant knows the elephant in its fullness. And maybe, to paraphrase the Rig Veda, maybe even the elephant knows not. Right? Reality is vast and complex and beyond the comprehension of a finite mind. So how did these Jain doctrines originate? How is it that Jains began viewing reality in this way? So one likely source for these Jain doctrines of relativity, Anekantavada, Nayavada, and Syadvada, was Mahavira's approach to questions about reality with contrary answers, the famous avyakta or unanswerable questions to which the Buddha often responded with silence. Mahavira, of course, is the 24th Tirthankar, the 24th enlightened teacher of the Jain tradition. According to Jain teaching, in any given kalpa, in any given cosmic cycle, there are 24 Tirthankars that appear in a particular world, in a particular world space. In our world, Mahavir is the 24th. As a historical figure, he's believed to have lived around the 6th century before the Common Era, roughly around the same time as the Buddha, slightly older contemporary of the Buddha. And if you look at the Jain agamas, the Jain scriptures that record Mahavir's teaching, they are from a very similar environment and similar milieu as the Pali canon of Buddhism. Because as far as the historical record can show, Mahavir lived around what is now Bihar, eastern Uttar Pradesh, that region, roughly the same region where the Buddha lived. And so it was a similar environment. And both Mahavir and Buddha were renouncers. They had followers, and those followers went on and developed a tradition out of their teachings. So during the time of Mahavir and Buddha, there was a set of questions that were considered unanswerable. That is, one could posit answers to them, but there was a great deal of debate about them. And there was also often a lot of skepticism. People did not always believe one could actually know the answers to these questions. Just a couple of examples. The universe and the soul, the jiva, the living essence of a being. Are these eternal? Excuse me. Or are they non-eternal? That is, has the universe always existed, and will it always exist? Has the soul always existed? Will it always exist? These were things that were debated among various darshanas, various systems of philosophy, different worldviews in ancient India. So Mahavir took what you could call a both and approach to these questions. That is, some would say the universe is eternal. It has always existed, it will always exist. Others will say no. They'll say it was created, it emerged at a certain time, it will pass away at a certain time. Similarly, with the soul or the essence of a living being, some would say that we have always existed, right? The Bhagavad Gita teaches we've always existed and we will always exist. And then others said, well, no, there's the body, it's born, it lives, it dies, and that's the person, and so no, it's not eternal. So these would be debated a great deal. And Mahavir would take, in a sense, both sides of the argument and say, well, in a certain sense, this view is correct, and in another sense, this other view is correct. So this is a nice quotation from a translation of the Bhagavati Sutra. This is from the Jain Agamas, the Shvetambara Agamas. The Venerable Mahavira told his disciple, the Bhikkhu Jamali, thus: the world is, Jamali, eternal. It did not cease to exist at any time. It was, it is, and it will be. It is constant, permanent, eternal, imperishable, indestructible, and always existent. The world is, Jamali, non-eternal, for it becomes progressive in time cycle after being regressive, and it becomes regressive after becoming progressive. The soul is, Jamali, eternal, for it did not cease to exist at any time. The soul is, Jamali, non-eternal, for it becomes animal after being a hellish creature, becomes a man after becoming an animal, and it becomes a god after being a man. And so you see here in what Mahavir is saying that he's taking the possible answers to these questions and situating them within the larger context of the Jain worldview. So the world is eternal in the sense that it has always existed and it will always exist. It's imperishable. However, according to Jain teaching, the world does not remain the same. The world changes from moment to moment. And over vast cycles of time, it changes a great deal. There's something called the utsarpani, that is the progressive scale of time in which things improve in the universe. And there's a regressive cycle, the avasarpani, where things decline. And so the universe goes through these cycles of progression and decline, and it changes. And it's really, you could say, not the same universe from era to era. So in that sense, it's non-eternal. This particular universe, if by that we mean this existing scenario right now. That is not eternal. That will pass away. It will not come back. A new cycle will come. Something else will happen. Things will change. Same with the soul. The soul has always existed and will always exist. It never ceased to be, right? Again, the Gita's doctrine as well. However, if by the soul we're talking about the person as they are at a certain stage, at a certain point in time, well, that changes also constantly. Even within one lifetime, our physical body changes a great deal. I often ask my students, what were you like 20 years ago? Well, many of them weren't born yet, or they were babies or small children. Now they're young people. Someday they'll be elderly people. They change. And then if you extend that through many lifetimes, in one lifetime you might be a dog, in one lifetime you might be a rabbit, in one lifetime you might be a human being, and so on. And so we change. Therefore, the soul is not the same. It's not, in one sense, the same soul, even from moment to moment, because if by soul we're referring to the entire state of being, then no, that's going to change. So you can see that Mahavira's casting the Jain worldview as this vast field of possibility in which all of the different answers to these questions could be in some sense true and in some sense false. The Jain both-and approach to ultimate questions is presented by later Jain authors as a kind of middle path, intellectual middle path, between Buddhist and Hindu metaphysical views based on ideas of impermanence and permanence, respectively. If you know much about Buddhist philosophy, you know that one of the key teachings of Buddhism is that reality is constantly changing. It is anitya, right? This is the first noble truth, sarvam anityam, all is impermanent. In Hindu traditions like Vedanta, you have an emphasis on Brahman, which is unchanging. In views like Nyaya, there is talk of dravyas or substances which don't change. They're basically permanent features of the universe. And this Jain view that there is both a changing and an unchanging aspect of reality is a way of bringing those together. Say, well, the Buddhists are right when you're talking about the modalities through which a being goes through time. Yes, those are all impermanent. But the various Hindu traditions also are correct. They're looking at what is continuous through all the various phases of time. So they're both right? So this is a kind of Jain way to moderate any potential conflict between these varied views, and also to present the Jain worldview as capable of integrating both. According to the scholar Piotr Botserowicz, it's also possible that the Jain doctrines of relativity emerge from out of Jain ascetic discourse about which entities are living and which are not. This discourse is vital to the practice of ahimsa, or nonviolence in thought, word, and deed, taking care that one is not inadvertently destroying small life forms. So according to Balcerowitz's research, there are early Jain texts and early Jain conversations about, when you're moving about in the world and when you're looking at various, especially very small entities, how do you determine what is living and what is not? Because if something's alive, you need to be very careful around it and not accidentally destroy it. And some entities may be ambiguous. Is it alive? Is it not alive? Well, you could say in one sense it is, in one sense it's not. Think about plants, for example. They are, for the most part, inanimate, yet they have life. So how should they be treated? And these kinds of questions about nonviolence are one possible source from which this system of philosophy came. The Jain doctrines of relativity can also be seen as logically following from the Jain conception of reality as irreducibly pluralistic. That is, from a Jain point of view, reality is made up of different types of entity, and those differences never really dissolve, right? This is somewhat different from, for example, Advaita Vedanta, where everything ultimately is Brahman, right? Everything ultimately is one, and plurality, diversity is an effect of Maya. From a Jain point of view, plurality, diversity are real things, and they are not, one type of entity is not reducible to another. According to traditional Jain ontology, the cosmos is made up of 6 basic types of substance, dravya or astikaya, as they're also called. The substances are not reducible to one another or to any further 7th element, right? There's not some kind of super substance that subsumes them in Jain thought, kind of like Brahman and Vedanta. So what are the elements? There is the jiva, the soul or life force, pudgala, that is non-living matter, dharma, which means the same things it means in Jainism that it means in Hindu traditions, about a way of life and virtues and ethics. But in Jain metaphysics, dharma also refers to the principle of motion. What is it that makes motion possible? And adharma, the principle of inertia. In fact, you could see parallels maybe between the Jain idea of dharma and the guna of rajas in the Sankhya school of thought. It's a dynamic principle, whereas adharma would be more like tamas, kind of a principle of inertia. You have akash, that is space, and then kala, time. Finally, relativity can also be seen as following logically from the Jain understanding of the soul as having both an unchanging basic nature, its dravya, and changing qualities, gunas, and modes or paryayas that all arise from karma. So this is very similar to what Mahavira was saying earlier about the soul being both eternal and non-eternal, has an eternal dravya and changing gunas and paryayas. This shapes the Jain understanding of the nature of a real entity as being characterized by arising, perishing, and endurance. And this is the classic definition of a real entity that's given in the Jain text, the Tattvartha Sutra of Umaswati, who lived sometime from the 1st to 3rd centuries of the Common Era. The 29th verse of the 5th chapter of the Tattvartha Sutra is Utpada Vyayava Dravya Yuktam Sat, or being, Sat, is that which undergoes arising, utpada, perishing, vyayava, and endurance through time, dravya. It is yuktam, yoked or linked to these three qualities. So a being arises, it exists for a period of time, it passes away. This is the Jain understanding of the nature of the soul. How does this connect with relativity? Because our questions about the nature of reality includes things like, are they eternal? Are they non-eternal? And here you see this ability to incorporate both. So complexity is introduced into the system. As we saw with the idea of the 6 dravyas, there's more complexity in the system. Are you talking from the perspective of the principle of motion? Are you talking from the perspective of time, from the perspective of space, from the perspective of a soul, from the perspective of non-living matter, and so on? So you have this complex picture of reality. And so the Anekanta idea arises very naturally from that. So how did these ideas develop later on? Okay, the Tattvartha Sutra is a relatively early text, early in the Common Era. It's also the one text that the two main schools of Jainism, the Shvetambara and the Digambara, agree upon. So the basic conception of reality in the Tattvartha Sutra is pretty uniformly held across the Jain tradition. So Jain authors of the period beyond this, from roughly the 5th century to the 17th century, a long period of time, further developed the basic idea of relativity that emerges from the Jain Agamas and the Tattvartha Sutra. Digambara Jain thinkers such as Kunda Kunda, Siddhasena Divakara, and Samantabhadra, as well as Shvetambara thinkers such as Haribhadra Suri and Yashovijaya, developed a distinctively Jain approach to the concept of philosophical difference. So it's from the works of these various authors that I've been generalizing everything I've been saying about Anekantavada, Nayavada, and Syadvada. And I'm going to continue in that vein. Just a quick review. Anekantavada, again, is the idea that reality is inherently complex. This eventually develops into the idea that every entity has potentially infinite facets or dimensions. Nayavada is an epistemological doctrine that corresponds with Anekantavada. Every facet of an entity corresponds to a perspective from which it can be viewed and from which true statements can be made about it, which brings us to Syadvada, a doctrine about how truth is expressed in sentences. According to this doctrine, a metaphysical claim is true, syat, that is, from a certain point of view. From other points of view, it may be false, it may be both true and false, and so on. We're going to see the different levels of truth that are possible according to Syadvada. In Sanskrit, Syat normally is a form of the verb be or us, which means it may be, it could be. But in Jain technical usage, it doesn't really mean maybe, it means in a certain sense, like it is definitely such and such from a certain perspective, but not from all perspectives. So, as I just mentioned, there are different levels of truth according to Syadvada. This is why it is sometimes called the Saptabhanginaya, that is the 7-limbed perspective. So what are the 7 levels of truth? Well, this is really an exhaustive list of the senses in which, or the truth values, you could say, a sentence can have from various senses in which it is expressed. So a statement can be true from one perspective, but it can also be false from another perspective. Remember the blue facet of the diamond. Someone says this diamond is blue. Well, that's true of that facet, but it may be false of another facet. Both true and false, if you consider both facets. Indescribable, because there's another sense in which we can't really say whether something is true or not, because there may be facets of that entity. Again, if it has potentially infinite facets, there's always going to be some aspect of it that is not captured in what one is saying. So again, to go back to our example of the blue and the red facets of the diamond, let's say I say the diamond is blue. True when I'm talking about the blue facet, false if I'm talking about the red facet. Both true and false if I consider both of those as being aspects of the diamond in tandem. Indescribable in the sense that there are aspects of the diamond to which the term color does not even apply. What about the hardness of the diamond? What about its existence through time? What about its location in space? Blue or red doesn't tell you anything about that, right? Those are indescribable. They're beyond the capacity of that particular claim to encompass them. There are three more levels of truth, which are the result of combining these first four. There are only three because beyond three, then these start to become redundant. So you have something that can be true and indescribable, false and indescribable, true, false, and indescribable. And if you look, if you try to add to those seven, you're going to be repeating. Excuse me. Excuse me. You're going to be repeating yourself. So, say true, true, and indescribable. One of those truths is redundant. So these really are the seven possible truth values of any given claim. So an example of this, the seven levels of truth. I was talking before about facets of the diamond. There's another example we can use, a very simple one, a pen. Right, I've got one right here. Right, so let's use this pen as an example. This pen exists inasmuch as it embodies certain characteristics at a certain time. When I say certain characteristics, I mean pen characteristics, right? What is a pen? Well, it has a function. I have to be able to write with it. It uses ink. It has a certain shape. This is what makes it identifiable as a pen. But a pen does not exist inasmuch as it does not embody other characteristics or at other times. There was a time when this pen was not there, right? Before it was manufactured. There will come a time when it no longer exists. Sorry, pen, but you're impermanent. It will eventually pass away. So it doesn't exist in those times. It only exists during the period of its dravya, right, of its endurance. A pen only embodies certain characteristics, right? This does not have the characteristics of a notebook or of a washing machine or of an automobile, right? It has those characteristics that embody it are present right now. The others do not exist. A real thing is, you could say, a nexus of the existence and non-existence of all the possible qualities in the universe. So the pen has, you could say, a relative or limited existence. A pen both does and does not exist if one takes into account both of the first two perspectives. And from yet another perspective, a pen's existence is indescribable. There may be aspects and facets of this pen that no statement I make about it can really capture. I don't know what it's like to be this pen, for example. It's beyond something that I could possibly conceive of. And then you have the three possible non-redundant combinations of all of these four. So many modern Jain thinkers have seen the doctrine of relativity as an application of ahimsa, nonviolence, to the realm of philosophical discourse, such as Acharya Mahapragya, the late Acharya Mahapragya, pictured here. I lived from 1920 to 2010. Much of my own thought, in fact, on these doctrines has been shaped by his writings, which I utilized when I wrote my dissertation on this topic back in the late 90s. Brilliant thinker, and he saw the capacity of these ideas to actually apply to the realm of nonviolence. Because if someone's saying the diamond's red, someone's saying the diamond's blue, someone's saying the pen exists, someone's saying the pen doesn't exist, right? These are the kinds of things that people fight about. though usually we're not talking about diamonds and pens. We're talking about things like God. We're talking about things like morality or karma or the nature of existence itself. And of course, there's a vast diversity of schools of thought, religions, philosophies, and that diversity is a wonderful thing. Each school of thought reveals, sheds light on a different facet of existence, but typically they try to cancel each other out. And this can happen on the intellectual level, but that can very easily extend into the realm of how we actually treat other human beings with different worldviews. And of course, history is full of violence between members of different religious communities, people with different economic philosophies or political philosophies. Again and again, we see these things lead to violence. If we thought in terms of relativity, if rather than looking at difference and otherness as a cause for conflict, we saw it instead as illuminating the multiple facets of reality, this would help us practice nonviolence. If you have a different worldview from me, rather than say, oh, you are my enemy, or you must be wrong, or you saying I must be wrong, we say, oh, what can I learn from you? What can I learn from you about that other part of the elephant that I'm not feeling? So to go back to the metaphor of the blind men and the elephant, although it was not always conceived this way by pre-modern Jain thinkers, in fact, it was often used quite aggressively to show non-Jain perspectives as partial in contrast with the holistic truth of Jainism. Logically speaking, it can be used this way, right? Some scholars have argued, no, this is not really ahimsa, because a lot of the ancient Jains were basically saying, Hindu and Buddhist worldviews, if they were partially correct, that basically meant they were inadequate. The full truth could be seen in this more complex understanding of reality. Yes, that's how they were often used, but not always. There were Jain thinkers, even in ancient times, who saw these doctrines as a way of affirming, yes, there's something good in the other perspective. There's something true in the other perspective. They should all be respected. Both Haribhadra Suri, going back to the 5th to 6th century of the Common Era, and Yashovijaya, more recently in the 17th century, perceived the potential of these doctrines to express truth in a charitable way, right? They looked kindly on other traditions, affirming what they saw as positive in other traditions. Haribhadra Suri, for example, very famously, in his Yoga Drishti Samuchaya, a collection of views on yoga, he talks about the fact that there are differences in what various teachers say. And then he argues that this is because they were presenting the ideas to different disciples at different times. But the ultimate truth they're all leading to is freedom from rebirth and liberation from the cycle, ultimate bliss, nirvana. And so they're really not in conflict. Yashovijaya also very famously drew deeply from Hindu schools of thought and used various Hindu texts and approaches when he was developing his Jain worldview. He didn't see these sources as something that were wrong or negative. He studied the Navya Nyaya, the New Logic school of thought in Benares during his lifetime. Also, there are several texts where he quotes extensively from the Bhagavad Gita, without saying, oh, this is a non-Jain text, we shouldn't read this. No, he sees it as a source of wisdom, so he's tapping into it. So this is an example of this very non-violent approach to difference, drawing upon many, many sources. Today, many Jains see these doctrines as expressing the distinctively Jain version of worldview pluralism. Worldview pluralism means basically the idea that many worldviews exist and are valuable, that it's good that there's a diversity of worldviews. In the past, this has been called religious pluralism. I've also written about religious pluralism, but I see no reason why it should be limited to religions. There are many worldviews that are not religious. The word religion is also found problematic by many people, but worldviews, everybody has a worldview, right? So everyone has a way of seeing reality. Darshana is a good equivalent of worldview in Sanskrit. So this is the Jain version of this idea of truth in many darshanas. This is the equivalent of Hindu concepts like dharma samanvaya, the harmony of religions, taught by Swami Vivekananda, or sarvadharma samabhava, the equality of religions, as taught by Mahatma Gandhi. So this is a Jain philosophical version of that. In fact, Gandhi explicitly tapped into Jain teaching. There's a letter that he writes, an editorial in one of his publications, where he talks about Anekantavada and Syadvad, and he sees this as a way of viewing others' perspectives in a complementary way rather than as antagonistic. So let's make this practical, right? Practical Anekantavada. Just as Swami Vivekananda sought to apply the concepts of Vedanta to daily living, developing the idea of practical Vedanta, we can similarly conceive of a practical Anekantavada, in which we apply the Jain philosophy of infinite diversity to our encounters with those whose worldviews differ from our own. The aim is to see otherness or difference not as a threat or the other as an enemy or a competitor, but to see otherness rather as evidence of the rich complexity of existence and the fact that there's always more to learn beyond the current horizons of our knowledge, more pieces of the proverbial elephant that we're not grasping. Then we can say with Swami Vivekananda, I accept all religions that were there in the past and worship with them all. I worship God with every one of them in whatever form they worship him. Not only shall I do all these, but I shall keep my heart open for all that may come in the future. We take in all that has been in the past, enjoy the light of the present, and open every window of the heart for all that will come in the future. Salutation to all the prophets of the past, to all the great ones of the present, and to all that are to come in the future. So this is, of course, coming from Swami Vivekananda from his Vedanta perspective, but the ultimate vision is very similar, right? That there are many perspectives, there are many diverse ways of understanding and approaching reality. And rather than simply hold on to our own and dismiss all the others, let us see all perspectives as capable of enlightening us, of showing us different facets of the truth. Of course, there's going to be disagreement. Of course, there will be different interpretations and ways of approaching reality. But the idea is that there's something we can learn from everyone. And to simply dismiss an entire worldview, an entire belief system, is mistaken because we're dismissing what might be valuable knowledge. This is a more nonviolent approach to otherness and difference than what has tended to predominate around the world. And it's really a great gift, I would say, of the Indic civilization to the world, that not only the Jain version of this, but there are Hindu versions of this, there are Buddhist versions of this. This pluralism is really a wonderful gift, and it's something that it would be great to see all of the world learn from this, and to incorporate this much more open-minded perspective into our ways of thinking whenever we're dealing with a worldview, a philosophy, or a religious belief that's different from whatever we ourselves might hold. And some of you might see the picture of Thakur, of Sri Ramakrishna behind me. He lived this kind of practical Anekantavada himself. I don't think he used that term. He wasn't Jain, but he practiced many different traditions. He followed sadhanas that were based in diverse forms of Hinduism, in Christianity and Islam, and he found samadhi, he found enlightenment in all of them. And so in the same way, in the spirit of practical Anekantavada, we need to listen to one another, be open to one another, and in this way learn to live together and with one another. So thank you very much for listening. I think I'm within my time, so that's good. And again, I wish I could be with you live and get all your wonderful questions and comments and learn from all of you. But when you watch this, I am going to be deep asleep. So namaste again to everyone, and all the best.